Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is presented by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing, the industry's #1 specialty travel company and the fly shop for the world of fly fishing. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now your host, author, photographer, and world traveler, Jim Klug.
Wild salmon are one of the great natural migrations left on this planet. Every year, these fish travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles from the ocean back to the rivers where they were born. And for thousands of years, those migrations have shaped entire ecosystems across the Pacific Rim. But here's the hard truth. Across the Pacific Northwest, more than 90% of historic wild salmon and steelhead runs have disappeared, and hundreds of individual runs are now listed under the Endangered Species Act. And yet, in a few remaining places, rivers in Alaska, British Columbia, Kamchatka, and in certain parts of the Pacific Northwest, wild salmon still return in numbers that feel almost prehistoric. Protecting those places and protecting those runs is the work of today's guest. Guido Rahr is the president and CEO of the Wild Salmon Center, an organization working across the entire Pacific Rim to safeguard the last great wild salmon ecosystems on Earth. Under Guido's leadership, the Wild Salmon Center has helped protect more than 35 million acres of salmon habitats, established conservation organizations across the North Pacific, and helped create large-scale habitat reserves on some of the most important salmon rivers left on the planet. Guido is also a lifelong angler and intrepid traveler, someone who has spent decades exploring, working on, and fishing some of the wildest salmon rivers anywhere in the world. The Waypoints podcast is brought to you by Patagonia. To bring their gear to life, Patagonia is motivated by relentless curiosity and a passion for the wild. They evaluate hundreds of materials, build dozens of prototypes, and spend seasons punishing them in the world's most extreme conditions. The work is the guide, and Patagonia never tires of exploring, learning, and improving. The all-new River Salt 2 wading boot is an incredible product that solves key issues for anglers in both salt and freshwater environments. These new boots are lightweight, fast-drying, and built to perform across a full range of conditions, from mountain streams to tropical flats. Best of all, they are designed for speed, so you can slip them on and have them laced and ready to go in seconds. They combined abrasion-resistant Cordura nylon mesh uppers with a Vibram Mega Grip sole for reliable traction on wet and dry surfaces. The result is a single boot that reliably performs in any scenario. Available now through Yellow Dog Fly Fishing and Patagonia, the new River Salt 2 wading boot. Guido, welcome to Waypoints. It is great to finally have you here and have you on the show.
Psyched to be here.
Well, I've got a question. I gotta know right off the bat. Okay, Guido, when you go to a restaurant, say with your wife or a group of friends, and the waiter or waitress tells you that the nightly special is fresh salmon, okay, are you the guy that immediately asks the question, is the salmon wild or is it farm raised?
I always ask that question because I don't want to eat it if it's farm raised. And wild, you want to select wild, preferably Alaska, sustainably harvest wild. But if you really want to get good salmon, you go for a nice bright Chinook. I mean, you know.
I had to ask that question because I do this all the time, and it always embarrasses the hell out of my wife and kids. But I'm like, I'm going to stop you right there. Is your salmon wild? And the funny thing is I don't even eat fish. So they're like, why are you doing that, Dad? You're not even going to order the salmon. I'm like, no, I know, but I just want to know.
But you have to do it, too, to send a signal, back to the institution through the waiters and the chefs. And, what kind of fish are we serving? Because people care. Every time you do that, it sends a signal, which is important.
It is important. Well, That's good. I'm glad I'm not the only one that does that. My wife, I'm going to tell her that too. I'm like, I'm not the only one that embarrasses his family at restaurants. So that's good. Well, let's start with your own story, Guido. Where did you grow up and how did fishing first enter your life?
So I grew up outside of Portland, Oregon, oldest of 5 kids, kind of a big chaotic family. And, we grew up, the ethos of the family is hunting and fishing, and this goes back generations. But I was a strange little kid, in some ways I still am. And from a really early age, I just was like being alone by myself, kind of long blonde hair, kind of weird, strange little introverted kid. Didn't go to the soccer games and I wasn't doing sports, but what I was doing was just roaming the hillsides by myself. And I was obsessed, and still am, with reptiles and amphibians. And I guess it's free-range parenting, and I'd look under rocks and boards, and I knew where to find ensatinas and Pacific giant salamanders and rough-skinned newts and the rubber boa, which was the great find. And I lived for that stuff. And I never felt insecure about it. I didn't have any kind of real social life, really, with my buddies. And, there were trade-offs there, but by the time I was 11, I'd memorized all the species, genuses and species and their Latin names all through the North America. I just poured, an interesting anecdote there was I grew up with some learning challenges. And at one point, my parents bought me a copy of Raymond Dittmar's Reptiles of North America, big, thick.
Yeah, it's probably like 900 pages.
Oh, no, it was I read every single page again and again. And that solved my reading issues right there. But also learning the Latin names is actually, I think, what they say, what fires together, wires together neurologically. So I've had learning new languages has been easier for me. And so there were some good things there.
Nice.
Yeah.
And then, from reptiles and amphibians to fish, tell us about that journey.
So I just when you hunt things, anything, it's like a portal into the natural world, and you learn more and more. And each day, each rock you look under, each pool you look into is a portal into the natural world and is like a new discovery. And for me, every day was Christmas, opening presents. All the mysteries, and it's completely engrossing. And I believe that we're wired for this kind of thing, and we've been that way for thousands of years. And just in the last couple of hundred, we've separated ourselves from nature, and those neurons and those pathways have withered a bit, but they were very strong for me. And so we had a cabin on the Deschutes River in Oregon, still do, a big, cold, fast river that charges through a basalt canyon in the high desert. And it's got native rainbows, red band trout. And my grandparents fished and my aunts and uncles fished, and they disappear in the morning and come back late at night with stories of heroic close encounters with rainbows, steelhead sometimes. And I remember just, my head was about level with the table thinking, how cool that sounded. And then when they wouldn't teach me actually how to fly fish because my grandfather was very possessive about the pressure on the river. And so I happened to have a spinning rod, an ultralight spinning rod, and some jointed rapalas. And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to try this. And I just laid waste to all these fish. And finally, it was a crisis in the community. And they said, we've got to teach him how to fly fish now before he freaking manhandles every... these fish never saw a rapala,
You're probably like 8 years old and just out fishing everybody.
Oh, walking back to camp with, an 18-inch rainbow as I walked by the cabins, and they're, oh my God, DEFCON 9, So I learned how to fly tie, and it was a natural transition.
Yeah, so you discovered fly fishing early as a child, and from that point, you were literally hooked.
I was completely hooked. Yeah.
Well, then you go on to study English literature at University of Oregon, of course, go Ducks. Later, environmental studies at Yale. At what point did radical fish activist become the career path that kind of presented itself to you?
So what happened to me was I fished all through my teens, and I was still collecting reptiles. And I went to University of Oregon, and I hosted a little cable access fly fishing show. And I just went deep on fly tying and fly fishing. And then I got a chance to move to the tropics and work for the Nature Conservancy in Chiapas, Mexico, which is just north of Guatemala and is a real biological diversity hotspot. Man, it's really a hotspot for reptiles and amphibians. So I went down there, arrived in Tuxtla Gutierrez, Chiapas, Mexico. The temperature was 116 degrees. The air was full of smoke from everybody burning the fields to clear the rainforest and montane and the cloud forest for for corn and agriculture. But in Chiapas are some mountain ranges that have the strange type of rainforest called the cloud forest, and they're the very tops, and they're spectacularly beautiful. Mist and all these different species and orchids and bromeliads and the famous Quetzalcoatl, which is a species of trogon that may be the most beautiful bird in the Americas. The Aztecs worshiped them. So we worked on protecting the cloud forest, and then I moved from there on to other tropical forest conservation projects all through my 20s. And finally, by this time I'd been, graduated through the different hierarchy and ended up at a group called Conservation International. And I had this gnawing feeling that while this work was important, it felt like it wasn't necessarily my fight. It wasn't I was always being reminded, thank you for coming and helping us, Guido, but this is kind of our thing. And I was, of course, totally respect that. Well, then I went back to grad school, and then I read a scientific paper that was called Salmon at the Crossroads, which was published by Willa Nelson and Jim Likotowicz, and then another co-author that I can't remember, that documented the declines of wild salmon and steelhead in the Pacific Northwest. And it's the first time they looked at what was really going on, and it was a full-blown crisis. I mean, coho salmon were down to 3% of their historic abundance. We were on the edge of losing a lot of species in a lot of rivers, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is my home waters, and these species are cratering. So then I completely shifted to salmon and steelhead conservation, worked for a scrappy little group called Oregon Trout, and we filed the petitions to list many of those as endangered species. And I got a crash course in salmon politics and conservation politics, and this is a blood sport because they say that the salmon make the spotted owl look like a pigeon or something as far as the impact on the region. So I dove in with both feet.
And those were exciting times. We've talked a lot in previous episodes about those early years of Oregon Trout. That was the group through an early member named Craig Lacey that first introduced me to fly fishing when I was a teenager. I was like 13, 14 years old, learned from Craig. And I remember being at the house and kind of sitting in and watching some of these meetings as a kid. And it was radical fish politics. I mean, it was full crisis mode. People were engaged. They were fired up. And like you said, it was a scrappy little group.
Yeah.
But it was taking on this monumental challenge at the time and calling attention to a real crisis that a lot of people weren't talking about in those days. I'm really impressed that you know about Oregon Trout. They were what detonated this whole thing. And Bill Bakke, puffing on his pipe. Bakke was an absolute legend.
Total legend,
Yeah.
Still is.
Yeah.
And they created a massive conservation movement. And then after that, the big national groups came in, and Oregon Trout kind of, like this thundering herd of, all the big nationals. But the heart and soul of it was Oregon Trout.
Mm-hmm. It was. I actually still have the entire collection of all the Oregon Trout stamp prints from all of those years framed in a big collection. I mean, those were amazing years and a great time to be in Oregon as a kid.
A great time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Someone should write a book about Oregon Trout.
I think somebody will eventually because, I mean, the impact that small group had on even modern day conservation is sizable. And, of course, that group is merged into what is today Freshwater Trust, and they're still doing great work out there.
Excellent work.
As well. Excellent work, yeah. Our buddy Joe Whitworth, who we all know and sometimes love. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of the moment then. Was that kind of the mid-'90s when you had that epiphany and realized that wild salmon were in such serious trouble?
Two things happened. One was it was a crisis, and the only best tools we had were the Endangered Species Act. But also it was clear that the endangered by the time a fish or any species is listed as an endangered species, it's in the emergency room already. And the things that cause that decline are often in place, whether it's dams and clear cuts and agriculture, whatever. And that's important to have the emergency room and to fight that. But if we really want to have healthy salmon and steelhead runs in 100 years, we have to think really strategically also, not instead of the ESA approach, but in addition to finding the systems that bad things haven't happened to those places yet. And so if we can get ahead of the next generation of threats, maybe we can actually hang on to some of these places as they are now in 100 years. And for me, one of the epiphanies I had was reading a speech written by a Unitarian minister named Livingston Stone. And he gave a speech to the American Fishery Society in the late 1800s that was fascinating. He said, he said, if we don't do something now about protecting our wild salmon, they will go the way of the bison. Circumstances will arise that we can't predict right now that will close the doors to having the miracle of these systems. And of course, with salmon and steelhead and trout, they're part of an integrated ecosystem, but because of their powerful ecological connections with everything, if you save that, you're really saving the whole system. And people don't really care about ecosystems, but they love these species because they're one of the few handholds we have into the natural world, diving into their world. And so Livingston Stone, it was like, my gosh, if we'd have done what he proposed setting up whole rivers to be protected forever, knowing that we couldn't save all of them. And we didn't. And today, all we have really left in California now is the Smith and the options. And so I thought that is so powerful. So the concept of taking a 100-year view and asking a question of what is it really going to take to deliver to our great-grandkids the miracle of a healthy wild salmon river. And I'm just going to digress here just for a minute. This concept as a conservationist of what it's going to take is fundamental because it's really easy to dive into conservation and do a little bit of this and fight the crisis du jour, but you're still on a treadmill kind of moving backwards. And a mentor of mine, Peter Seligman, who co-founded Conservation International, has created another group called Neoterra. He is a legend. And he said, Guido, do you ever feel like you're on a treadmill moving backwards? And I'm like, yeah, and my legs are getting tired. He said, you need to think about what's it really going to take to get to where you want to go. And that makes you zoom up again to the 10,000-foot level and also expand your planning horizon out a long time. And it makes you think differently about the conservation work. So I wrote some scientific papers on the strategy, referencing Livingston Stone, and thought, well, let's look at the whole, about that same time, we could see it from maps that the Pacific Rim was one integrated system with the Bering Strait as a small interruption in what's really one long continuous coastline that goes from Japan to California. And thought, well, what if we could target the best watersheds in each region and protect those proactively so that they're still intact? And the cost of protecting those can be a little bit lower than the cost of having to restore them. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not an alternative to restoring the most endangered systems. This is a complement to it, but it wasn't being done. And so that really has been my life's work. It's been 25 years, and I'm quite fulfilled and proud of that work.
Well, and that is what led to Wild Salmon Center. And I want you to talk a little bit about the organization, kind of how it started in those post-Oregon trout years, and tell our listeners a little bit about what the organization does.
Well, Wild Salmon Center was founded by an amazing person named Peter Soverel. And it didn't have any professional staff, and what it did have is an exchange of anglers with Kamchatka. So let me take a step back. So about this time, Russia opened up in the early 90s, and I was one of the first people over there. And it literally was like the curtain was opening to a previously unknown landscape that mirrors the Pacific Northwest. It's just endless, beautiful rivers and mountains and watersheds, all the same species, most of the same species we have, incredible abundance, and you can fly a helicopter all day and not see a single trace of human life. No roads, nothing. Kamchatka, the size of California, had something like 300,000 people. And going to Russia in those early days was like going back in time to look like what the Northwest used to look like. And so I had gotten back from Kamchatka, and then Peter made an expedition a couple of years later, and then we hooked up. And I said, let me build your organization and run it. So I became the first paid staff, grew it from, we had $25,000 in the bank, Peter went on to eventually leave Wild Salmon Center and form another group called Conservation Angler. And I just brick by brick built the Wild Salmon Center up with just laser focus on this one big idea.
Well, it's been an amazing success story. One of the concepts, and this is going to get back to what you're talking about, how everything is kind of interconnected, that giant coastline from Japan all the way through Alaska, BC, down into California, of course, the Pacific Northwest. You guys helped pioneer the concept of salmon strongholds. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that idea?
Right. So a stronghold is a place where the system is still relatively intact. So the first thing we did is we gathered scientists from Japan and Russia and Canada and the United States and said, okay, which are the most important volumes, I guess, in each genre in the library that we just must protect? And so we broke the Pacific Rim into ecological regions all the way from Japan down to California and went through a selection process and found the systems that were the best centers of abundance, diversity, habitat health, where our investment could safeguard them, basically. And, the strongholds in California are not as rich as the ones in Alaska, but we can't lose those because otherwise we'll lose all the locally adapted species and the connection that people have with the fish. So we mapped out the strongholds, and the archipelago is now, it's 119 rivers, organized in 20 kind of blocks, like the major strongholds. And it's 110 million acres of land. It's huge. If we can do this, and we will, this will be the most ambitious conservation strategy for any species across the Pacific Rim or the Atlantic. So that's the big idea. And so the strongholds are the most important systems in each region of the North Pacific. I mean, Bristol Bay is the most classic, the Skeena, the Dean, and Butte Creek on the lower Sacramento. One creek is the last strong population of spring Chinook left in the entire state of California. When it goes, that may be the end of spring Chinook in that whole part of the world. But so you get the idea. We're anchoring each area.
Well, one thing you touched on just a moment ago, a lot of conservation groups focus on restoring damaged rivers, right? That seems to be a common theme that we've heard about for decades, essentially playing cleanup. You use the analogy of the emergency room, right? It's like, okay, it's on life support. Now it's getting our attention. The Wild Salmon Center model is a bit different in that it focuses on protecting these strongholds, the healthiest remaining rivers before they decline. And this is very much kind of an offense versus traditional defense approach, which is, it seems like common sense, but it is still kind of unusual in the conservation world. So many people are constantly playing defense and constantly focused on playing catch up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the concept, but it's not that symmetrical. So on the Oregon coast, the strongest remaining rivers south of Canada, and we think are Oregon coastal systems. Well, and the Olympic Peninsula is also a collection of really important watersheds and so on down into California. But we need to protect those, and most of them are in good shape and are protectable because of the public lands. And it enables us to get conservation at scale versus having to buy all of it. But we still need to restore the lower sections of those rivers. So we have restoration teams working all the way from the Olympic Peninsula down into Butte Creek in California. But the idea is the marginal cost of getting watershed ecosystem conservation in a strong system is lower than a system that's really beat up, where we have to basically redo everything. I don't know if that's clear, but that's the concept. So
absolutely,
yeah.
It's clear. Yeah. And again, so much of it just makes sense when you think about getting ahead of these challenges. Yet I'm always amazed that so few groups are actually able to do that. It's a lot easier said than done.
It is a lot easier said than done, and you have to be willing to commit to a place and say, we are never going away. We are never going to let something catastrophic happen to this watershed. And we'll fail, and we'll fail, and we'll fail, but we are going to win in the end. And it's that durability. Some of these wins we've had have taken 20 years, but sometimes you just have to make that forever commitment. And I think that works. You've got to weather the swings of the political pendulum and the local demographic swings. But there's just nothing more satisfying than wading into a river that you're part of the reason it's still healthy. And also the other part of this equation is the people on the front lines are the local groups working there. So what's really worked for us is we just support the local groups as best we can and help them win. It's not like our brand is front and center. They have the social license and the deepest commitment to the watersheds. And the systems that are the strongholds still have communities that want salmon and fish. Unlike, you take a system where the salmon runs are gone and it's now smallmouth bass, it does shift the commitment. People are like, I like those smallmouth bass. I like smallmouth bass too, but not in salmon and steelhead rivers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that strikes me at Wild Salmon Center is kind of the audacity of the entire model. I mean, it's so, I think, common for groups to say, we're going to focus on this specific drainage or this specific river, right? We're going to create a foundation that's the so-and-so river foundation. But, I mean, you guys are talking about, an area that encompasses, Alaska, British Columbia, the entire Pacific Northwest, Russia, even Japan. I mean, that is a bold footprint right there, but it all gets back to the interconnectivity of these salmon strongholds. It's not just about one river or one drainage or one watershed or fishery. It's all connected. And I mean, that is a bold thing to focus on.
It is bold. It is bold. I will say that when you can connect the people, the leaders in those watersheds with each other, I mean, from Russia, even northern Japan, British Columbia, they learn from each other, and we can accelerate the rate of innovation and conservation. That's a piece of that.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Well, I want to specifically ask you about some of the unusual places that you've worked with Wild Salmon Center, places you've traveled, places you've fished. You already touched and mentioned Kamchatka, but Kamchatka is an area that's often described as really the truly last wild salmon ecosystem in the world. You talked about going there in the early 90s as being like a step back in time. Having had the privilege of fishing over there a number of times myself, I mean, it's just it's unbelievable that it still exists over there. Just how wild and I mean, there's no people, there's no development, there's very little infrastructure, especially outside of the city of Petropavlovsk. That you said maybe 300,000 people on the peninsula. Most of them live in that city. Right. Yeah. So you get out of there, there's no roads, there's no connectivity. It's all helicopter transportation. But the Wild Salmon Center, from your first moment of joining the group and then really taking it from there, was deeply involved in conservation work in Kamchatka. Tell us about kind of that first experience. Go back to that, about seeing those wild Russian rivers for the first time and the impact that made on you.
It literally was walking into a lost world, or going back in time. I mean, you fly into Kamchatka, across the Bering Sea. At this point, there was some little airline called Revolution Air. The Russians called it Revolution Air. And I remember flying into Petropavlovsk, which and smelling the sulfur from the volcanoes in the cockpit of the plane. And then you drop down through the clouds and you see these beautiful symmetrical volcanoes still smoking as far as you can see in this blue water and these mountains. And then arcing through the trees are just the most beautiful trout streams you've ever seen. But there was no roads. And so really it's hard to get around without a helicopter. I was introduced there by a Russian scientist named Mikhail Skopets, who really is the Indiana Jones of salmon and char, especially, and steelhead in the Russian Far East. And Misha is a scientist. He's a brilliant scientist, but he's also an explorer. And he's been a very, very close friend of mine for a long, long time. And we've explored a lot of these rivers together. And he took me down a river called the Bolshaya, which you probably remember. It was the only accessible one. And it was just a classic experience. It's like, what about life jackets? No, Guido, we don't need life jackets. It doesn't really help. You can swim, right? And we weren't in rafts. We were in these like big kind of inner tubes. And we had this incredible experience. I mean, Misha, what about rapids? And he's like, no problem. So we go around the corner on the second day, and there's another raft with a bunch of men standing around at a fire, celebrating something. It was like noon. and they were a Russian submarine crew that was on their rotation off, and they would like greeted us, and Misha wanted to ask them if there were any rapids downstream, and they heard me speak English, and they all stopped and stared at me. This is the first contact with their mortal enemy for all these years, and they said, Amerikansky, and they all hugged me, and we all drank some vodka shots and had this great East versus West moment. But the Russians are a wonderful, highly educated, passionate people. And so we just had an extraordinary experience. And then after that, I started going over regularly and working with the Russian scientists and exploring the rivers. And some of them hadn't even been floated yet. And Russia has a really old and venerable park system. So we thought, well, thinking of Livingston Stone, this is their chance to set aside some of these rivers. And so we would helicopter into a watershed, document the biodiversity, look at the ecoregions, qualify as a stronghold, and then with Russian partners, and we helped create organizations over there back when we could do those things and support local groups, collaboratively with the Russians, peer-to-peer, say this should be protected. And one by one, we got a number that helped the Russians move a number of these watersheds into their park system. So we'd fly into a watershed, do the work. We did this 8 times, and the millions of acres. And that is such an extraordinary feeling. And that brought me into all of these distant watersheds and learning them and being part of this vanguard of Western fishermen. And I'll say that our relationship with the Russians, peer-to-peer, learning from each other, it had nothing to do with the geopolitics of NATO and Western Europe. These were 2 nations and people that cared about this stuff just as passionately. And so for 20 years, we had this great relationship with the Russians, and we'd bring them over here and say, look at what happened to these rivers. You don't want this to happen over here. Remember, Russia's 40% of the world's wild salmon on the Russian Far East side. So it was one of the most extraordinary experiences of my life. It really was.
Well, as we all know, over the past few years, the geopolitical landscape has changed dramatically in our relations with Russia. And in fact, Russia has labeled many Western conservation NGOs as, quote, undesirable organizations, which I thought would make like a cool T-shirt to just have that undesirable organization. But how do you think some of these rivers that you did so much work on for 2 decades, these rivers in Kamchatka are faring these days with few visitors, very few outfitting companies still operating, few anglers actually visiting these areas? What do you think the status of these rivers are?
Russia designates. So in the geopolitical mess between the U.S. and Russia, a lot of Greenpeace and World Wildlife Fund, and then us were designated as undesirable. That means the Russians really can't legally work with us. We used to operate under something called the Area 5 Treaty, and it authorized these kind of exchanges. And the door closed on us. So that means we really can't work in Russia right now. I want to get back to Russia, and we will get back to Russia. I tend to be optimistic, but we intend to get back, but not right now for obvious reasons. But since then, a lot of the conservation work that we did with the Russians is holding. They continue to designate protected areas on these key salmon rivers. The fishery, which used to be dominated by illegal fishing and poaching, that chapter has not ended, but now the fisheries are being managed very sustainably in Kamchatka. And we helped the Russians get certification for their fishery, meaning they're audited by something called the Marine Stewardship Council. So this just means that it's not poached and there's a traceability. They're still sticking with that, having external auditors review their commercial fisheries. So everything seems to be sticking in Kamchatka. Now, there are new gold and mining operations that are being proposed, and so it's not all a rosy picture, but the pace of development in Russia is not nearly as fast as it is in North America. Other parts of Russia, Sakhalin Island is really struggling. I could go into the details on what's happening place by place, but more or less the runs in Russia remain relatively strong in Kamchatka and the northern part of the Russian Far East. Now, as you go south to the Amur River, for example, this is a vast system that really flows all the way from Mongolia into the Pacific Ocean or Sea of Japan, just across from Hokkaido, basically, north of Hokkaido. And its salmon runs are approaching extinction. I mean, it's like the Columbia or the Sacramento down to just a very small number of fish. And it's a real heartbreaker. So it's not all rosy, but there's certainly, their systems are in better shape than our systems in the continental United States.
Well, that's interesting. I know a lot of anglers that had the privilege of fishing Kamchatka before things closed down several years ago. That's a question we get a lot. It's like, is the poaching an issue? There's no one there to monitor it. So it's good to hear that things seem to be holding over there, because you're right. There will come a time when we'll be able to get back over there and visit and fish for sure. Well, you talked about Sakhalin Island. You talked about some of these other areas in Russia. I know that you've also done some work over there chasing giant taimen on the Tugur. Is that right?
The Tugur.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about that fishery.
So the Tugur is the river that I can't stop dreaming about. I mean, I've never seen a system like it. So this all started when Skopets, Mikhail Skopets said, Guido, there's a river in the Russian Far East that is really amazing. And it has taimen, but these taimen are extremely large. And I was like, well, why are they so large? And he said, well, it seems like they eat, of course, ducks, and small mammals, but they prey on adult chum salmon. So this is a taimen, same as in Mongolia, same species.
Hucho.
Yeah. Hucho taimen that feeds on other salmon. And and he said, but it's a hard river to get to and it's extremely remote. So I finally, by this time, a few years after Skopets wrote about this, a very powerful Russian businessman named Alexander Abromov secured the fishing leases on the Tugur. And he's a big taimen fisherman because the Russians worship taimen. It's like their national fish. And it's fascinating what happened. Alexander showed up on the Tugur, but it was being poached like crazy for ikura, and they were, which is salmon caviar. And so the chum runs, there were on every gravel bar, there was gill nets going across, and people were coming in from Khabarovsk and on these tank type vehicles. They can just go right through the forest, or helicopters, and poaching for ikura. And because the taimen eat the chum, Alexander realized this was an existential threat to his fishery. So he brought in a Chechen military detachment on the rotation off and said, bring your weapons. I need some help with the poaching. And
that redefines anti-poaching as a concept right there.
I've never seen anything like it. Put it this way, they cleaned up the Tugur. I mean, the poaching, I've never seen anything like it.
Probably fairly quickly, I would imagine.
It didn't take long. Everybody knew, just stay away from the Tugur. And he kind of saved that river. Since then, Russian colleagues have gotten the whole watershed basically protected as a park. But Alexander invited me to fish with him on the Tugur, and nobody had been ever fly fishing it. And he said, Guido, you fly fish my river and see if you can catch a world record. Well, we knew that all the world records, not just for taimen, but for any salmonid in the whole family that includes Atlantic salmon, Pacific salmon, char, etc., were going to be caught in this river. But we showed up on the river and we couldn't catch anything. I mean, it was perfect habitat. So the Tugur, to understand the Tugur, think of a low gradient alluvial system, meaning the river kind of cuts sideways with endless braids and swamps and marshes and all the habitat complexity that our rivers used to have before that was lost to agriculture. So you're seeing this biological engine of just enormous numbers of invertebrates, grayling, lennox, which is kind of an Asian trout, the nutrient pulse from the salmon and dying and marine-derived nutrients spreading throughout. I mean, it was just humming. And so we started fishing it, and it took us a long time to learn how to fish it. I went back each year, and we were tying different patterns. Finally, we noticed when there was a hatch, the grayling and the lennox would be near the surface, rising for dries. And every now and then you'd see this whoosh and like startling, monster thing going on the surface. And we thought, they're targeting grayling. So we started tying big tube flies that looked like grayling and shooting heads and shooting heads and using a big spay rod, one of those Echo King rods, which were great. And we started catching fish. But you didn't catch any small ones. Of course, now I know why, because they would be eaten by these giant taimen. So just like a big brown trout in the depths of a pool, these taimen were in the pools and they dropped into the tailouts and to feed, and the head And so you'd catch one fish a day maybe, but it'd be like 50 pounds. So we started catching 50-pound fish, 60-pound, and breaking fish off and straightening hooks and just jarring experiences because you're not catching a lot. Finally, my biggest one was 84 pounds.
An 84-pound taimen.
84-pound taimen. And then there were Ilya Sharbovich, who's one of Russia's best fly fishers, terrific guy.
Yeah, big saltwater angler.
Angler, Atlantic salmon, used to be on my board. And he started targeting these too. And so Ilya and I both took turns kind of, setting the different records, the IGFA, just for fun. But Ilya went back one year after my 84-pounder and was like, okay, my turn. And he spent 2 weeks there, and he caught like 105-pound taimen,
On a fly.
Oh, on a fly. He got really good at fishing those fish. And so just about the time I was going to go after Ilya's record, the doors closed. And he's had the place to himself, which but it was amazing. And then you're with Alexander and his bodyguards and going up and down this river and learning how to fish it. And, we're just scratching the surface. It was incredible.
Wow, that is something. What a story. And good to hear that so many of those ecosystems and rivers are still being protected and are still good. That's inspiring.
I think it is inspiring. And, getting in there early makes a difference. And you have to be pragmatic about your power and finding it. One of the early days in Russia, I met there's a gentleman named Jim Wolfenson, used to be the head of the World Bank, and he's a fly fisher. And I was introduced to Jim, and I met him in New York, and I said, this is the idea. We want to help the Russians set up this network of protected rivers. And he looked at me, and he said, Guido, you need to talk to the oligarchs. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah, they're the ones that have the power right now. And he said, I want to introduce you to someone named Oleg Deripaska. And I'm like, Oleg Deripaska? He was the richest guy in Russia at that point, worth many, many, many billions of dollars. And he said, I think he might be able to help you. So I'm like, thank you, Jim. And I flew to Moscow and to meet with Oleg. But the day before, I had lunch with the New York Times reporter there named Chris Chivers, who's an amazing writer. And Chris is like, what are you doing in Moscow? And I'm like, I'm meeting this guy, Oleg Deripaska. And he just stopped eating and he looked up at me and he said, do you have any idea who that is? And I'm like, kind of. I'm hoping he can help us stop the logging on this river called the Samarga, which is in the Sea of Japan, and it has sea-run taimen, which are actually a whole different genus than hucho. It's fascinating. They get to be 70 pounds, and it's like a sea-run brown, ancient fish. Anyway, I said, maybe Oleg could help stop the logging on the Samarga. And he goes, Guido, Oleg Deripaska could make one phone call and stop the logging on the Samarga and have the entire logging crew deported from Russia with one phone call. So the next day we met Oleg in an airport with all of his security and people. And he got the vision and wanted to help us. But about that time, Oleg was running into his own trouble with the State Department and that thing kind of fell apart. But my feeling is if you want to save places at scale, you need to be able to leverage power on any side of the political spectrum. And I will spend all day talking to guys like Oleg Deripaska or whoever can help us get this work done. Because in the Russian environment, those guys have a lot of power. And if you can find guys like that in their hearts are passionate about the fish, that's really important.
Yeah. Oh, that's called serious juice right there.
Serious juice.
Yeah. Well, another place where Wild Salmon Center, as well as many others, have been deeply engaged for many years is Alaska, and specifically the Bristol Bay area. And if you're an angler, you know about Bristol Bay. You know about the Pebble Mine issue up there. There's a long battle that's continues to be waged over the proposed Pebble Mine project. But for those few listeners that maybe are not familiar with this issue and don't know the history of Pebble, can you quickly walk us through why this mine project has become such a defining conservation issue for our sport?
So this issue is not just a defining conservation issue for our sport. It is the single most consequential place-based conservation fight in the last 25 years or 30. I can't think of anything else at that scale. That's because the scale of the watershed and the fact that it is the single largest population or combination of populations of wild salmon in the world. Bristol Bay produces more wild salmon than any place on Earth. There are up to 70 million fish arrive each year for free from the ocean. You can see the runs from an airplane. It is a phenomena like nothing else on the planet. And it's also a food security issue for our species. I mean, all those sockeye in particular, those are fish that we eat and need. It's one of the last great sources of wild protein in a world increasingly dominated by agriculturally driven protein, if that makes sense. So it's also a beautiful system. So what happened with Bristol Bay was at the end of the Pleistocene glaciation and those glaciers melted, it left a bunch of big, huge lakes that are crystal clear, drop-dead gorgeous, and a myriad of beautiful rivers that flow west into the ocean out of this area that's many, many, many million acres. And sockeye rear in lakes. So they spawn on lake shores and small tributaries, but they live the first part of their lives in lakes. They are lake species. And then they move to the ocean, grow, and then come back. So this place is a major, major driver of the economy, commercial fisheries, worth billions of dollars. Well, 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, a Canadian mining company discovered in the headwaters of Bristol Bay the largest undeveloped copper and gold mine in the world. It was an incredible deposit, and it's now valued at over $400 billion. And some say it could be worth twice that, given the current price of metals. So Northern Dynasty Minerals, the Canadian company, pushed to get this permitted. And a lot of us worked on blocking those permits. And we were pretty successful. It was on state land, and the governor, Dunleavy, and the local really wanted to build this mine. Then it looked like it was actually going to happen and that we were going to lose. And this was during the first Trump administration. And I remember sending a warning out or an alert to all of our supporters saying, I think Trump's going to permit this mine within months. And an amazing thing happened. Somebody emailed me and said, Guido, there's someone that might be able to help you. And I thought, okay. And this was within months of the permitting. And if that permit had gone through then, they would be literally developing this mine right now. We would have lost.
And again, this mine location is at the headwaters of so many of these consequential rivers in Bristol Bay. I mean, the impacts of that mining, could have been absolutely devastating to the entire ecosystem up there.
That deposit, that mine was so big, and the tailings pond behind the mine this would have been a giant mine with a massive amount of toxic tailings. That's the leftovers from the mining that would have remained upstream from the world's most productive salmon rivers in geological time. This would have been there for it never would go away. And the problem is that kind of sulfite mining releases toxins and acidity into the water. And a lake system, especially a river system, when you mess with the acidity, it changes everything. So you could see how it could shift the chemistry of those lakes that produce the sockeye. And it was right upstream from the headwaters of Tulare Creek, which is one of the greatest trophy rainbow trout fisheries. The second problem is it's on one of the most active seismic zones along the Pacific Rim. They regularly have earthquakes. So can you think of a worse idea? It's like a Damocles sword hanging over this whole thing. That when is it going to slide and blow?
Yeah, we're going to have all these huge toxic holding ponds. Yeah. And in one of the most seismically active areas on the planet. You think about, what could go wrong? Are you kidding me?
And just so a bunch of guys can get rich and, this mining
multinational companies.
Yeah. Yeah. So this alert went out, and then somebody called me the next day, and he said, Guido, I think I can help you with the Pebble Mine. And I'm like, well, that's great. He tell me about the Pebble Mine. I'm like, well, first of all, who are you? And he said, my name's Nick Ayers. And I said, Nick Ayers, cool. And he said, no, I was Vice President Pence's chief of staff until a few weeks ago. I'm in touch with the White House regularly. And critically, Donald Trump Jr., who fishes and hunts up there. Tell me about Pebble. And I did. And he said, this is a bad idea intrinsically, but second, it's bad for the Republican Party. I think I can help you. And Nick did something that was absolutely amazing and fascinating. So we worked really closely together, and with Don Jr., who I don't have a personal relationship with, but Nick does. And Nick got Don to tweet his dad and say, Mr. President, please protect Bristol Bay for all the millions of hunters and fishermen in the United States, something to that effect. And then Nick said, I want you to retweet Donald, you and all your environmental friends, retweet Donald Trump Jr.'s tweet. And it created a Twitter storm. And by the end of the day, Jane Fonda was retweeting Donald Trump Jr.'s tweet. And this was like, you can't even make this stuff up. And the share price on Northern Dynasty Minerals just freaking cratered that day. And long story short, the administration completely pivoted and blocked the permits for Pebble Mine. And it just showed that you have to reach out to people in the strangest circumstances and across the political spectrum, because a lot of those people, they may not see themselves as environmentalists, but they see themselves as conservationists, and they love the stuff that we love. And that's like the Teddy Roosevelt, aura in history. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. He protected huge areas. And so it just showed the importance of that. So that was an important win. Yeah.
And is it a done deal? I mean, is that win final, or now that we're in the second administration, there's still conversations about Pebble? Has anything changed under the second administration? Is this something that anglers and conservationists need to remain vigilant about for the foreseeable future?
So we always have to be vigilant. And with a deposit worth that much, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. It's on state land. It'd be different if it was federal land. So what happened after that is the Biden administration then did another layer of protection, the highest protections we could get under any available law, which was the Clean Water Act. And then we were feeling pretty good about that. And then the second Trump administration started, and it looked like it was going the other way. And because this administration is very intent on developing natural resources in Alaska. So we've been able to have some credibility with the administration. And right now, they are dead set on protecting Bristol Bay. And the marine area is now off limits for oil and gas development. So I'm proud that this administration, in this case, is doing the right thing so far. It looks pretty strong. They just released a legal brief saying we are not going to allow this mine to happen in Bristol Bay. And this just happened a few weeks ago. I'm feeling good about Pebble's demise right now. But there is a wrinkle. So in Bristol Bay, there's another category of land that's public land. It's BLM land, federal land, 1.2 million acres downstream from the deposit. On the president's first day in office, he signed an executive order that was listed what the Alaska state wanted, and one of them was to lift protections for all of these BLM lands. There are 28 million acres of these lands. They're called the D1 lands. And by law, once the protections are lifted, they cannot be protected again by the next administration if they were so inclined, because of different legal aspects of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and so on. So we are extremely worried about this. And what we are hoping and asking is that the administration doesn't lift the protections on these D1 lands. Now, as it turns out, except for Bristol Bay, the rest of them are not big oil and gas priorities. So they don't really conflict with the president's energy policy. This isn't the North Slope, but this is parts of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Bristol Bay, the Copper River. 28 million acres is half the size of Arizona. So there's a lot at stake right now. This is still playing out. I'm optimistic that we're going to make some progress, but the jury's out still.
And people need to be paying attention to this. The battle is in a good place right now, but as you said, it's never really done, and you always have to remain vigilant about this, and you have to pay attention as an angler, as somebody who cares about these places.
It is. I mean, in my family, and my father and grandfather said, with the privilege of fishing these beautiful waters comes the obligation, to protect them. And that's a permanent phenomena. So you said it perfectly.
Yeah. Well, we could talk about Alaska, Bristol Bay, and the Pebble issue for hours, and we could do multiple episodes on that. But I do want to move on to some of the other areas in which you guys have done a lot of work and traveling. You talked about Taimen in Russia on the Tagore, but you've also been very active in Mongolia. You've been heavily involved in conservation efforts for the Taimen of Mongolia, and it is, this is one of the largest, most legendary freshwater fish in the world. How did Wild Salmon Center first become involved in Mongolia?
Well, I was first in Mongolia in 1992 as the first Western fishing trip into Mongolia, and got a glimpse of it then, which was almost as amazing, or in some ways as amazing as the Russian Far East. It's like Montana 200 years ago, with just vast grasslands and spectacular rivers and clear water, and this dinosaur of a trout called the taimen. They have huge taimen in Mongolia. It's literally like fishing a Montana stream, but there's a whole other spectrum on the size spectrum of these enormous fish. And then we started working again in Mongolia a few years ago, realizing that the whole taimen world is interconnected between Russia, Mongolia, and Japan. And Mongolia had done an amazing job with recreation, like Mark Johnstad and Mongolia River Outfitters and the Vermilions on the Egg and the Ur, and showed that you can generate funding and support for conservation by bringing fishermen there. And they really help protect these rivers. And so I thought we've got to spread this model to Russia and other places and learn from the Mongolians. So we've been very active now in Mongolia. Now, we don't have much time in Mongolia because there's a combination of hydroelectric development and mining and overgrazing, frankly. A lot of the rivers are now dying, and it's, again, like it is in the Pacific Rim, it's moving north. And so we're focusing on the Delgur and the Onan right now and trying to do a few things. One is to understand the science of what's really going on in the river and where these fish are going and what their tolerances are. So our organization, Science is the North Star. It tells us where we work and what we do and if we did it. It doesn't tell us how to do the work. And so we've been very active in Mongolia and on a range of conservation efforts on these two rivers. And we're really grateful that Yellow Dog has become the major supporter of this work. So, hey, man, thank you for helping fill the tank on this thing. It's not an easy place to get support to work. So it's an amazing place. If you ever have a chance to go to Mongolia and float those rivers, and the culture is so rich. I mean, the Mongolians are just an incredible people. They're warm, and they have this ancient history and all this rich. I mean, you're going along and you see somebody on horseback dressed in the traditional clothes, and it culturally, scenically, and the fishing, it all comes together in Mongolia.
Yeah, it's a special destination. I mean, as you mentioned a minute ago, when you're traveling in these areas of Mongolia, you almost feel like you're traveling through like eastern Montana. There's a sense of the familiar about the landscape,
yeah. But
at the same time, it's just this ancient land that also happens to be home to the river wolf, the hucho. I mean, this incredible salmonid that is just unlike any other fish you can really target.
Right. No, it's a whole different thing. And it's where Genghis Khan came from and ended up dominating all of Eurasia from these vast and beautiful and remote rivers and grasslands. It's crazy.
Yeah, so much history. And again, for anglers that have been thinking about a trip to Mongolia, it is one to absolutely put at the top of the list. It is a spectacular destination, no doubt. Well, I think I know how you're going to answer this. So I'm going to take the Tagore River and your quest for that 100-pound plus taimen in Russia off the table. You can't answer the Tagore, right? But I get asked this question all the time. I'm going to present it to you. Is there a particular river somewhere in the world that holds such a special place for you personally that if you, again, get that question, okay, Guido, you have one last trip, one last fishery you can visit. What's your answer going to be on that one?
The Dean.
Great call.
Choosing among these rivers is like choosing among, different beautiful paintings or something. It's
like choosing a favorite child.
It's like choosing, you can't do it. You can't do it. It's like you can't compare I mean, the skeena by itself, and the babine, the kispiox, the sustet, the copper, each have their miracles and their surprises and their mysteries. But there's something about the Dean. It's beautiful. It's a deeply glaciated, there's cliffs on both sides. It's alluvial, so it's kind of fast and shallow for the most part. As a fly fisher knows, shallow and fast is good for swinging because the fish can't hide out in deep pools, or, you can get to them. The second thing about the Dean is the whole watershed's pristine. The third thing is it has a series of waterfalls down by the mouth and then also in the headwaters. So there's the steelhead that come in early have to make some huge jumps. I mean, over 12 feet, which is hard to imagine. For them to make those jumps, they've got to do that in the early season before the river drops. So you get races of fish coming in July or June, late June, and that are so out of control, so fat, so mint bright, just because remember, they're going to fast for like 10 months until they spawn in the spring, right about now. So they're coming in first week of July, and they're out of control. I mean, they do not want to get landed. And so what they're doing is they're racing to the headwaters so they can get over these waterfalls to reach this prime habitat. So this is the key, is the genetic and life history diversity. All these little races of fish, that's the key to their survival. And we have science teams documenting this on each river. So you'll be fishing the Dean, swinging through a run, transparent water, spectacular landscape. You're just smelling the air and just thinking, this is fish or not, this is beautiful. And when you hook a fish, you got to get a head shake, and then he goes. These fish, just like there's no head shake. I mean, just screaming right away. And either that fish is down around the bend, just cartwheeling, or it's behind you already, and your line's still going downstream. I have had Dean River fish jump. Now, maybe I'm wading up to my waist, but jump over my head at the head level with big head-tail jumps. So I love the Dean and I love to swing for summer Chinook. And I just love Chinook. I mean, that's really my favorite. And there's big, bright Chinook in there too. Yeah.
Quite a place.
Yeah, it's
the Dean,
amazing.
British Columbia. Mm-hmm. Well, despite the challenges and problems these days to so many of these fisheries, to these species, to these ecosystems, and we hear a lot about that. I mean, it seems like in the conservation world, you're just constantly inundated by a lot of doom and gloom, right? It's a noisy place out there for sure. Are there any positive and legitimate conservation successes that are happening right now in your mind? I mean, you've talked about your footprint, the network that you guys are focused on, a lot of these still relatively pristine fisheries that haven't been developed, haven't been degraded. But overall, are we seeing any encouraging signs on the conservation front? Is there anything that truly gives you hope when you think specifically about the future of wild salmon?
That's a really good question. And the answer is yes. So the Smith River in Northern California, the Smith River Alliance, who's protecting, they basically protected that watershed for the most part. The fish are being managed for wild fish. There is a mine proposed for the headwaters that we're going to be fighting over. So it's not all great. There is a threat there in Southwest Oregon. But the biggest success right now is what we discovered. So coho salmon, remember I mentioned they were down to 3% of historic abundance in the 90s. They've really come back. And that's because we did three things. We stopped the hatchery programs. We reduced harvest on those fish dramatically. And then we started restoring the habitat. And as it turns out, if you take a river that's channelized, because remember, it's all in agricultural fields, et cetera, and create side channels and little wetlands and reintroduce beavers and swampy places, that is where the biological productivity of these rivers is. It's not in the fast water, it's in the slow, swampy stuff on the side. And we started raising funds and carefully restoring this habitat. Other groups have been doing it too. And literally, while you're working, juvenile coho will eddy out and into these off-channel pieces. That's how important it is. It slows down. Remember, a salmon's survival is often driven in part by how big it gets before it hits salt water. So that has really worked, and I'm optimistic that we'll get coho removed as the first salmon ever recovered to the point it can be removed from the Endangered Species Act. And that's a total, I'm optimistic that's going to happen. I think the restoration, science-based restoration of some of these rivers is a bright spot. The other is really controlling the spread of fish hatcheries. Fish hatcheries are, they're not going away, but if we can keep them from opening new fish hatcheries in wild rivers and drawing the line there, the state of Oregon's done this. Remember, it is a constant battle. States like Washington have hatcheries on every river, basically, and they just keep dumping more hatchery fish in the river, and the runs continue to go down. So there's some, but the Olympic Peninsula, we're getting some traction now. Some of the tribes up there are more amenable to wild fish conservation, but it's a bit very incremental.
I'm glad you brought up the hatchery topic, because that is a massive factor when it comes to these anadromous fish, wild salmon. Again, topic we could talk about for hours. Yeah. I would encourage anybody to read up on this. If you haven't seen the movie Artificial, it's worth watching. I think Patagonia produced that, put that out a few years ago. It is an eye-opener. And you watch that. Spend an hour watching that movie, and it will definitely open your eyes to the threats of these hatcheries and what that means for wild fish. It's a powerful piece.
Yep.
Yeah, without question. And there's so many other issues. I mean, we talk about, dams, obviously climate change. I mean, these salmon are facing a lot of challenges. There's no doubt about it. But there is some reason for optimism. And I'm so glad that you address that, because, sometimes we feel like we're just pushing a boulder uphill on a lot of these issues. And when you do see some bright spots, that's encouraging. It keeps you going, and you definitely have to celebrate some of those wins when you get them.
Yeah. I mean, I will say that we're going to kill pebble. We're going to prevent that public land from being opened up. In British Columbia, the First Nations there are actually become strong partners protecting habitat, millions of acres on some of the best rivers like the Skeena, Upper Skeena, Nass, and the Taku. There's optimism there. We're going to reform the Pacific Salmon Treaty to curtail the marine harvest of a lot of species. I'm optimistic we're going to get that cut back. In Oregon, we're putting rivers back together. Yeah, there is hope. And shifting the management paradigm to wild fish and lowering the expectations to have to kill as many fish as we kill. You've got bright lights like the Smith and the chance to restore Butte Creek. If we can do that, that little creek that flows into the Sacramento River produces up to 20,000 spring Chinook a year. That's a big spring Chinook run anywhere. So there is some optimism there. I think Russia, for the most part, I think they're going to hang on to those systems. And I think the doors are going to open again someday so we can work with them on, because remember, we all share that same North Pacific ecosystem. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic. A lot of the worst mistakes were made in the past, and I think now we're redoubling our commitment, so I think we're going to get there.
Well, when you look back over your career, Guido, over the last, several decades of being a wild fish activist, from your work in Kamchatka to Bristol Bay to Mongolia to Northern California, the Pacific Northwest, so many wild places. What are some of the most important lessons you've learned about what actually moves the needle when it comes to protecting wild fish and wild rivers? And I know you referenced this a while ago about, strange bedfellows. You talked about some of the oligarchs. You talked about, Don Jr. I mean, people that you wouldn't necessarily think would lean into some of these issues. But some of the key lessons you've taken away from the last few decades about what it takes to move the needle.
So that's a great question. So I'd say three things that are different each. But first, each one of us needs to love and fight for the river, our home waters that we love. It's also fun and fulfilling to be that engaged. And there's no substitute for that, because it all comes down to the people that care the most about those rivers. And so that's one. And that's a job of every person listening to this, is make a real commitment to the waters where you spend most of your time. The second thing is, for me, the science, when deciding what to do, don't get caught up in who's catching the fish or, where the funding's coming from or anything. Look objectively at what the science says and let that be your North Star so you can focus on things that you can actually measure that they really got done. And the third, the most surprising thing is we can't get locked into this Democrat versus Republican cycle where you can only be effective under Democratic administrations. And this is true at the federal level, but it's also true at the state level. You have to get the durability is everything. And when I say that, it's really easy to spend a lot of money and get something done, and then it kind of goes away, when you take your foot off the gas or the political dynamic changes. So it's effective to be able to work both in Republican and Democratic administrations and to maintain credibility with both, because you'll lose everything that you got, as we've been seeing sometimes when the political pendulum swings. And the same thing's true in Russia. It's, our organization, the science, the integrity of our work is everything. But also we need to think objectively about what's it really going to take to have durable wins. And I mean, durable for us is 100 years. And that's when I'm an old man sitting on the side of the stream, Jim, with you, drinking some tequila after a day, I want us to look back and say, that river's still there. It's like, what a great feeling of satisfaction and an accomplishment of giving back to have that feeling.
Absolutely. 3 things. So important. Well, Guido, this has been great. We're going to wrap things up, but I do want to say for those listening to this podcast who care deeply about whether it's wild salmon and steelhead or these rivers or ecosystems, these wild places, what is the single most important thing they should understand about the future of these fish? And what are some things they can do today to help protect these fish in these places for future generations?
So there are 2 things. Okay, the most important thing for anyone listening to this podcast to know is that we don't have time. Things are changing so quickly, and you don't notice them in month to month, but you notice them from year to year. There'll be a gold mine proposal. There'll be someone wants to divert the river for something, whatever it is. It's really up to our generation because of the demographic and economic trends. We really don't have time. And so we need to do stuff now while we still can, because otherwise there's not going to be much to work with. The second thing is, I'll say we would be grateful for anyone to check us out and get involved with the Wild Salmon Center's work. We're very good at what we do, and I wouldn't call us a big flashy group, but we've been doing this and we know how to do it. And if you care about it, look us up, at www.wildsalmoncenter.org. We're online, and we could use some help, to be honest. The second thing is we've been really grappling with how do we get more people to care about the species. I mean, we care about it because we're anglers and we love the river and the fish. But we need more people to do that. And so we started working, and we're just now finishing the first salmon IMAX film. It's truly spectacular. So if anyone's seen an IMAX film, it's almost like being on the river. And so this IMAX project is called Running Wild, Return to the River. Remember Roger K. Brown's Return to the River. And it's narrated by Liam Neeson. It's 45 minutes. It's the first time that kind of footage has ever been collected. It's directed by Miles Connolly, who's one of the most famous IMAX directors, and it is a mind blower. We're going to screen it in April, and it'll start touring the country with shows in Alaska, in Seattle, Portland, California Academy of Sciences, Washington, D.C., and so on. So check out our website, find out where the IMAX film is playing, click in, and this film's going to live a long time and keep showing up. And so, check it out and check us out and help and give us some, any help would be appreciated. And go catch some fish.
Get out on the water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get involved.
Yeah.
Well, I for one, cannot wait for that IMAX project. This is going to be awesome to see that up in that giant screen. And God, what an ambitious project.
It's really ambitious.
It's going to be incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't wait till that comes out. Well, Guido, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for the time and thanks for sharing so much great information, all these great stories with our listeners. We really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up this latest episode of Waypoints. If you're dreaming about your next fly fishing adventure, be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com. It's the place to explore destinations, research trips, source the right gear and flies, and stay up to date on everything happening in the world of destination angling. At its core, fly fishing is really about the journey, the places we discover, the people we meet, and the stories we bring home. And of course, the best stories almost always start with a trip. Until next time, keep fishing, keep traveling, and remember, no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson and written by Jim Klug. Music is written and provided by bluegrass legend Woody Platt. Audio engineered by Sean McCormick. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more location profiles, destination information, travel news, and the industry's best selection of flies and equipment for destination angling.